I started our tour of the New Testament writers in an unusual way by starting with the more marginal general letters, 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude and Hebrews and Revelation. One reason I did that is because it gives us a chance to get to work on how to read biblical texts, learn some skills that we'll use the whole semester. But another one is because New Testament scholarship often focuses on the Gospels, of course, and Acts and the letters of Paul, and tends to neglect these other letters. And I wanted to give us a glimpse of what the New Testament margins look like. Here's that image I used from the lecture on the canonicity of Scripture. We've been out traveling the stars in the margins of this cluster. Now it's time to journey towards the core. And it turns out that the core doesn't look that different from what we see already at the margins. Even the so-called outliers of the New Testament writings sing in harmony. We haven't looked at 1st through 3rd John yet, but it's true of them as well. We'll examine them along with John's Gospel because their voice is so alike. We'll see at the core what we saw already. Congregations scattered around the Roman Empire with a shared identity and mission, who are focused on Jesus and who are led by the apostles and those the apostles have appointed, not just waiting for every order from their leaders, but engaging in the Christian life from the ground, which is a pretty adventurous life when we're talking about the first couple of generations of Christians living in the pagan Roman Empire. And we've seen these communities facing pressure from persecution, from buyer's remorse, from regret about what they've left behind, and from complacency as well as corruption. Yet even out there on the margins, we have seen signs of the influence of the Apostle Paul. His writings are mentioned at the end of 2nd Peter, and 1st Peter's content looks like Paul's content, and that makes sense. Out in the margins of a star cluster, they're still feeling the gravity of the core, and Acts provides a nice narrative, a nice accounting historically of how these communities happened around the Roman Empire. And an enormous influence, of course, was the Apostle Paul, which is why Luke's Acts of the Apostles shifts from Peter to a number of other voices and then focuses on Paul. Not just because Luke seems to have known Paul, but also because Paul is so influential. Paul was an engine of Christian vision, Christian mission, and Christian fellowship, Christian connectedness. He's not the only such engine, of course not, but he is a major one. Let's look at Paul's life and mission. Saul, or Paul, remember, those aren't his old name and his new name. Those are his Jewish name and his Roman name. I'm just going to call him Paul. Paul is a towering figure in the New Testament church and in world history. He's such a towering figure that he has been credited or blamed by a number of people throughout history of really being the author of Christianity, really being the architect of what we think of as the Christian tradition. I think that's too strong, but it does honor how influential Paul is. Let me give you an analogy for honoring Paul's influence without reducing Christianity to Paul's life and thought. In the Old Testament, God is not the God of Moses. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Moses is God's missionary. In fact, Moses is the strongest voice in the Torah and the most influential figure in Judaism from his day all the way to today. But despite all of that influence, God is not the God of Moses. Judaism is not the faith of Moses. Judaism's focus, and Moses' focus, is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, I would say the same about Paul. Paul is the Moses of Christianity. Immensely influential, a pivotal figure, and yet just an ambassador, just an emissary doing the work of Jesus who sent him. Moses' ministry moved from one setback to the next, but Paul's ministry was even more marked by setbacks and obstacles. He went from one crisis to the next. It reminds me of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where the Fellowship on its mission faces impossible situation after impossible situation. And yet somehow they prevail. And that is really how I read the career of Paul. He faces so much opposition and he ends up in prison how many times? And yet he is the most influential figure in the Western world, except for Jesus himself, whom he represents. This man who planted a message in a few cities in the Roman Empire, became one of the most influential human beings in history. And the question that I want to plant now and answer at the end is why? What is the nature of Paul's vast influence and power? I'll give you a biographical outline, although your surveys are going to do a great job doing the very same thing. And my outline will draw from the book of Acts as well as Paul's letters, as these do. Paul was trained as a rabbi and a Pharisee. The book of Acts says he was trained under Gamaliel. Paul's life as a Pharisee begs a question. He's obviously single during his ministry, and yet most Pharisees were married. So was he? Did his wife leave him when he became a Christian? Who knows? Acts doesn't tell us. He never tells us. There are lots of other things we don't know about his life because they weren't relevant to his mission, and his letters arise from his mission. By the way, in my lecture on Acts, I mentioned that the writer of Acts knew Paul well. Those we passages happen when Paul is with the writer. So the writer of Acts would have access to Paul's history, including, if Paul has a past with Gamaliel, his knowledge of Gamaliel. And that fact might grow your trust in Acts' account of Gamaliel's speech. Even if his appeal to Theudas was anachronistic, the writer of Acts really could have been in a position to know the nature of that meeting and what Gamaliel would have said if he has access through Paul to Gamaliel's circles. Christians had penetrated lots of Jewish circles in Jerusalem, at least Acts tells us that. There were Christian Pharisees, obviously Paul's one of them, and there are other Pharisees who come to faith in Jesus, according to the Gospels. Priests became Christians, Acts tells us that. So there are Christian networks within the Jewish institutions in Jerusalem, and Luke, through Paul, would have some access to those voices. Paul is a Pharisee. What are Pharisees? Pharisees have a reputation today because of how they're characterized in the Gospels. We'll talk more about those when we get to the Gospels. But for now, I'd like you to know that Pharisees represent a renewal movement within Palestinian Judaism, a renewal movement that's more popular with the people at large than some of the other Jewish groups like the Sadducees, who represented the upper class and who were more assimilationist in terms of Greco-Roman culture. Well, the Pharisees really wanted to keep Israel Jewish and actually to make Israel more and more covenantal. At the heart of their mission is to take the rules that apply to the priesthood, to make them holy, and apply them to the whole nation, to the people at large, so that Israel itself would be holy, not just an elite priestly caste, but the whole nation would be ready when God chooses through his Messiah to deliver it. That agenda, applying the priest's rules to the whole people, might be where Pharisees get their reputation for legalism, for being so concerned about itty-bitty rules that they sometimes miss the big picture. Well, that sounds like a distortion or a narrowing of an agenda which is well intended. We first hear about Paul in the book of Acts around the time that persecution arises and Stephen is martyred. Then Paul embarks on a campaign of persecution to wipe out this new Christian movement, which, according to him, of course, as a conventional Pharisee, follows a false Messiah, which risks leading the people astray and calling down God's wrath. So you can appreciate why Paul is so motivated to wipe out Christians. They are a threat not just to Israel's peace with Rome, but to something far more important to a Pharisee, to Israel's relationship with God and its readiness for the Messiah's coming. So famously, while on that mission to persecute the followers of Jesus, Paul meets up with the risen Jesus. This is recorded in Acts chapter 9, and Paul alludes to it in 1 Corinthians 9 and also 1 Corinthians 15. And Jesus, rather than wiping out Saul, appoints him apostle to the nations, to the Gentiles. And wow, what a world-changing appointment that was. Scholars have grown more reluctant lately to call this Paul's conversion because of the baggage of what the word conversion means. It's not like he changed gods from one god to another. Instead, he found out that the Messiah he was expecting had already arrived and was now commissioning him. Is that a conversion? Well, sure it is. As a teenager, I was a confirmed Presbyterian, and I was a skeptic. I didn't particularly believe in God. Over the next few years, I was converted to Christianity. I came to follow Jesus Christ. The word conversion means turning with, convert. Whatever the baggage of the term, Paul was turned from one vision of the God he followed to another, and I was turned from one form of the faith I professed, even though I hadn't believed it, to another. Have you been turned? Freshly converted, or freshly commissioned anyway, Paul spent time, he says, in Arabia, Antioch, and then Jerusalem, winning the trust of Christians who were understandably skeptical about this former persecutor, whether he was just a double agent. I have some maps to show you. I'm not too worried about you seeing all the particulars, but take a look at Paul's early travels from Jerusalem to Damascus and back into the Arabian desert, where, according to tradition, and there's some biblical confirmation of this, he preached the good news to some folks there and actually earned a reputation, which followed him. And across the Levant into Syria, Antioch in Syria, and up to Tarsus, where he comes from. Those are some of Paul's early travels in the immediate vicinity of the Israel of his day. Paul took his first missionary journey, it's recorded in Acts 13 and 14, then returned to Jerusalem for a conference concerning Gentile believers. Do they or do they not have to keep the law of Moses? That's recorded in Acts 15, and then the last half of 15 through Acts 18 describes his second missionary journey. Acts 18 through 21 describes his third missionary journey. These move ever westward to plant churches and to revisit churches that he planted and even visit churches that he hadn't planted. On these journeys, Paul sometimes would stay in the same city for many months. Whether he was in person or whether he was writing from a distance, sometimes because he was in prison, Paul led teams that would continue to pastor older congregations. Many of his letters depend on those team members for support, and some of the letters are to the leaders of those other teams, Timothy and Titus, for instance. Then come the last recorded travels of Paul in the book of Acts. Paul returned to Jerusalem despite warnings that it would be dangerous. He was arrested there, imprisoned in Jerusalem and Caesarea, and brought to Rome. This map shows his travels, including a shipwreck and some time on Crete and some time on the island of Malta. All this is in the end of the book of Acts. Finally, Paul arrived at Rome and spent 2 years there, imprisoned under Nero. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he expresses the desire to go west, even to visit Spain. Did he manage to do that? Christian tradition says that he did. He did get into the extreme west. So some scholars think Paul has a travel history that extends beyond the end of Acts 28, that he was released from Roman prison, went to Spain on his mission. Clement of Rome thought that, and then returned to Rome, where he was imprisoned and eventually beheaded under the Emperor Nero. That's a conventional chronology of Paul's life. It draws a lot on the accounts in the book of Acts. And this poses something of a problem because events and chronologies in Acts and the signs in Paul's letters are hard to reconcile fully. You can reconcile them to a point, but really only to a point. And this has led to a lot of scholarly work and guesswork, trying to determine what really happened, trying to determine how Paul's travels and how the dating of his letters and the location of his letters all fit together. My lecture outline offers 3 of many chronologies that people have offered over the years. I don't want you to feel pressure to learn or memorize them. I just offer them here so that you can get 2 senses. On the one hand, you can get a sense of the general consensus understanding of Paul's career, and on the other hand, you can see where scholars are taking sides and disagreeing. All 3 of these charts have Paul's conversion happening between, say, 31 and 36, which would mean a handful of years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Then we have various proposals for his visit to Jerusalem in the 40s, in the late 30s. His first missionary journey may be around 45, 46, 49. And if Galatians is the first letter he wrote, then it would have come from about this time. We also see the Jerusalem conference described in Acts chapter 15, where the question of Gentile believers is debated. You see that around 45, 46 to 49. Paul's second missionary journey may have begun in the early 50s, if not earlier. One proposal has his third missionary journey coming in 50. And in this era, we see him writing his letters to the Thessalonians and to the Corinthians. by the mid to late 50s, his third missionary journey if he hasn't done it already. And some other letters, all three proposals have Romans in the mid 50s. A proposal that the letters to the Galatians, the Philippians, and Philemon happened in the mid 50s. You'll see them come later in a number of chronologies. Arrest, imprisonment, and trials in the late 50s. His voyage to Rome in 60. While under arrest in Rome, he may have written a number of letters, including in this proposal the so-called pastoral letters. Paul might have been beheaded around 62, or perhaps in the middle column he was released and traveled, and while he was traveling wrote the later letters, 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy, in which case his death would have come in the late 60s instead of the early 60s. I hope that quick tour gives you both a sense of the overall shape of Paul's ministry, which doesn't look that different no matter who is doing the commentating, and some of the basis for scholarly disputes. And if you're being introduced to these disputes for the first time, it can be jarring and even overwhelming. And it can be hard to kind of find your way. It can be disorienting to just hear a lot of people saying, well, it might have been written here or there, it might have been written by Paul, someone else. I'd like you to see from that general shape how much of a consensus there is over some of Paul's career, in fact, the basic rudiments of Paul's career. And when you hear scholars disagreeing, now you have some context in which to put that disagreement.